Hello everyone. In this presentation, we shall be looking at how the fiscal deficit and money printing affects the aggregate demand in the economy. So we shall be looking at the effects of fiscal deficit and money printing on the economy in relation to aggregate demand, inflation, and supply and overall economic growth. So basically, fiscal deficit is the excess of government spending over its revenue. There are two ways to fund the fiscal deficit, as we shall see in the next slides. However, in whichever way the fiscal deficit is funded, that is with or without money printing, it leads to an increase in the aggregate demand of the economy. Now, in the first way, the government issues debt in the market. This debt is bought by the domestic private investors. Now, it's the domestic private investors' money that funds the fiscal deficit of the government. In this case, little new money is created in the economy, and because of that, what we call as the phenomenon of crowding out may occur, at least on the monetary side. Now, what's this phenomenon of crowding out? Now, since the money pool is almost the same and the government is taking an increased share of money, lesser money remains for the private players in the economy, and hence this can lead to an increase in interest rates and lower equity investments. In the second phenomenon, or the second way to fund fiscal deficit, since the government has monopoly over money supply, it can print money. How? The government issues debt. This debt is then bought by central banks. Now, the central bank can buy that government debt directly from the government, but usually it buys it indirectly through private players. And how it does that? By printing money, issuing fresh money, which in turn is deposited with the federal government, thus funding its fiscal deficit. In modern context, this is called QE, or quantitative easing. What are the consequences of the two ways of funding the fiscal deficit for the government and the economy? In both cases, the allocation or reallocation of real resources will happen in the economy. However, as we saw in the first case, since no new money or very little of new money is created in the economy, crowding out will occur on the monetary side, which can affect future investments and hence growth of the economy. In the second way, since new money is being created, no crowding out happens on the monetary side of the economy. Inflation, and this is important, inflation may or may not happen in both ways. We'll see how fiscal deficit affects inflation in the further slides, and how inflation can happen due to fiscal deficit. Inflation will happen due to the increased fiscal deficit only if we are close to hitting what we call boundary limits on the factors of production. So in other words, if there is slack in the factors of production, inflation is unlikely to occur. Let me explain by an example. Let's say there's a project of making a road and 100 people are employed in that project, while only 50 are needed in actual. This is what we call disguised unemployment. Now, in an adjacent commercial building, there's a work going on, and the contractor approaches the contractor, let's say the contractor B of that building approaches contractor A, who is on the job of making road. This contractor needs 10 workers to complete the project going on in the commercial complex. The project is installing statues to improve the aesthetic value of the area. Now, to be fair, the economic value of this project is quite small. However, since only 10 people are needed, and in any case there is slack in the labor, there's surplus labor working on the project, it's easy for the contractor A to give contractor B 10 laborers. With this decision, the road work is not affected in any way. The road is completed on time, and howsoever small the economic value of the project of installing statues to improve the aesthetic value is, the economy gains overall, and there is no inflation. The same example, but tweak the scenario a little bit. In this case, all 100 people are needed to make the road, and the contractor B again approaches contractor A to get 10 workers. However, this time the contractor A declines to give workers to contractor B, as all are needed to complete the road. Hence, contractor B offers to pay 1.5 times of wages to the laborers. That means inflation has increased in the economy, since the wages of the laborers have gone up. Now, because of this, since inflation has increased in the economy, the road work also gets affected. Since all 100 people are needed to complete the road, 10 move to complete the project in the commercial building that has low economic value. Since the road project is delayed, the overall productivity of the economy is also affected. And hence, in this scenario, there is inflation. This also leads to slowdown in the economy, unlike the previous scenario when there was slack available in the labor supply. Let's say in this case, the government increases its fiscal deficit and out of its benevolence doubles the health outlay in the economy, so that all needy, poor people get health cover. What will happen? A technological marvel that can improve the productivity may take 1 or 2 years to get created. A large expressway can be done in 3 to 4 years. But to create a doctor, it takes about 30 years. It's a human capital that takes a long time to create. And no matter the amount of money, no money can help beyond a point in that. And so, if the government does that, where would the good quality doctors come from? And hence, because of this very decision, increasing fiscal deficit in this way will immediately ensure that the boundary limits are hit. And that means the healthcare costs will zoom across the country. And this would affect the poor and the middle class in the worst possible way, quite contrary to what the government's intentions were. This time in poverty alleviation. Now, if the government spends aggressively on poverty alleviation, the demand will increase, and the supply would not be able to catch up immediately. This increases inflation. Sure, there would be some supply that would come on board in 3 to 4 years' time, but it will not be sufficient. Why? Because, again, lack of human capital. Some basic supply can come online, but beyond that, it will require good, skilled, knowledgeable workers to produce goods, which will be lacking in the economy. And again, since we have hit the boundary limits and there is no slack of labor available in the economy, inflation increase in this case as well. And we have discussed this in some other presentations about inflation and money supply, but I'll discuss it briefly here. Inflation overall in the economy, if it goes on for a longer time, leads to one thing, which is wealth transfer from poor or middle class to asset owners who are usually rich people. So now let's look at scenario wherein we'll see how increase in fiscal deficit leads to an increase in aggregate demand that can either lead to an economic growth or, in the wake of severe supply constraints in the economy, can cause even an economic collapse. So, let's say the government increases its fiscal deficit and takes in more debt. It funds its fiscal deficit through money printing. Now, this scenario will be valid even if the government funds its fiscal deficit through crowding out, albeit the degree may change. So the money supply in the economy or the credit in the economy increases, which leads to an increase in aggregate demand in the economy. Now, due to the increase in demand, in the first scenario, the domestic supply in the economy is not able to match up. Let's say the economy is producing at its optimum supply level. That means that the inflation levels in the economy will rise. However, in the second scenario, the economy is still not at its optimum supply level, thereby the supply responds and increases in the wake of increase in demand because of the increased fiscal deficit. That means that the inflation in the economy will be stable and not increase, and the economy will see growth. Now let's go back to the first scenario, which had inflation in the economy. And let's continue from there. So let's continue. Since the demand has risen in the economy and the supply constraints in the economy means that the demand has to be catered through increase in imports. This increase in imports would mean that the exchange rate, the domestic exchange rate, would start to fall, which will lead to an increase in inflation of the imported goods as well. Now, this increase in overall inflation in the economy would mean that demand would respond and would fall in the wake of increased prices. And this decline in demand would then lead to a decline in inflation levels. So the circle is complete. Basically, the increase in demand led to the increase in inflation, and the increase in inflation would then ultimately cull that very demand. This is how the natural corrective measures of the economy kick in, even though the government has made a policy error. However, let's see what happens when the government aggravates this situation by making even further policy errors. So now, instead of letting the natural economic corrective measures play out, the central government intervenes and increases its fiscal deficit further, thus taking on more debt. This debt is bought indirectly by the central bank through freshly printed money, essentially monetizing the debt and printing more money, which in then gives to the central government. This increase in fiscal deficit means that the aggregate demand is increased even further. So basically, there is increase in money supply in the economy, which leads to further increase in demand in spite of higher inflation. So that further increase in demand in spite of higher inflation, which cannot be catered by the supply, the domestic supply, leads to even higher inflation. And that higher inflation turns into galloping inflation finally. Now, of course, the central government can intervene in another way. So in this way, it can sell its debt instead of to the central bank to the domestic investors. Now herein, what happens is no fresh new money is created in the economy. However, because of the existing money pool, a larger share is taken by the central bank, crowding out can occur, leaving lesser money for the private investors, raising the interest rates, which would in turn means that the new investments in the supply declines. So then what happens? So the demand this time again increases because of the central government spending. However, things are made even worse because this time, as the central government has taken more money supply and hence increases the interest rate for private investors, the supply has also declined. So increase in demand, but at the same time decline in supply further, leading to galloping inflation. Now, due to this wrong central government intervention through increased fiscal deficit, ensuring that the aggregate demand in the economy continues to rise, the imports would continue to rise as the domestic supply levels cannot meet the increased demand. That means the country will keep on piling increasing levels of foreign debt, which implies that the exchange rate of the domestic currency will continue to fall, leading to imported price rise and overall price rise in the economy and shortages building up in the economy. Overall, leading to increase in the interest rates of the economy. Now, this combination of increase in interest rate, price rise of imported goods and shortages ensures that the domestic supply falls even further, even as the demand levels in the economy are maintained because of the increased fiscal deficit. This can then lead to scenarios of hyperinflation or even an economic crash in the economy. So let's conclude with some final points. Fiscal deficit achieved either through money printing or selling of debt to the private investors, that is, through crowding out private investment, increases aggregate demand in the economy. However, it leads to inflation only if the factors of production are close to their boundary limits, or in other words, if the economy is producing close to its optimum level. If, however, there is a lot of slack present in the economy, then inflation is unlikely, and actually increase in fiscal deficit, thereby increasing aggregate demand, can lead to increased growth and improvement in the economy. So it's better to have fiscal deficit though through money printing than crowding out, as if the fiscal deficit is increased through crowding out phenomena, even though demand increase may be slightly lower, but it leads to inefficient allocation of resources and impacts the private investments and hence overall supply of the economy. In case the resources are tight in the economy already and inflation is feared, then in high inflation times, fiscal deficit should be reduced rather than increased through any methodology. As we have seen, it could have serious ramifications on the economy and can hurt the economy real bad. So not just how fiscal deficit affects inflation, it's actually inflation levels also affect the fiscal deficit policy. And finally, only in some rare situations, like when one has to control some skewed demand in certain sectors of the economy or make some specific wealth transfer in the economy, is when fiscal deficit should be increased through the crowding out phenomenon. So thank you very much for watching the presentation. Do subscribe if you like such content and comment in case you have any queries. Thank you.